In God whose word I praise, in the Lord whose word I praise, in God alone I trust, I will not be afraid. What can mortal man do to me?
And hello, everyone, and welcome back once again to Preterist Apologetics with my friend Mike Sullivan. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And this is our second installment of a review, kind of an examination of the recent debate from millennialists, not dispensationalists, or at least he says he's not, Dr. Michael Brown, and of course, Steve Gregg. I've debated both of these men personally on the internet. And, actually, Brown on the internet, I had two debates with him. Steve Gregg, I had a formal 2-day public debate in Denver, Colorado some years ago. So the debate was more than a little interesting on several fronts. And so Mike and I want to take a look. We began this last week. You can go back and you can watch our review of that. We certainly did not cover all of the territory that we needed to. And so we thought we would pick it up again this evening and try to cover some of them. And to be honest about it, we're looking at more of the points made or attempted to be made by Michael Brown more than Steve Gregg. We would agree with a good deal of Steve Gregg's comments. Certainly, we're not futurists. He is. And Steve's position on Romans chapter 11, to me, is more than a little bit confusing and confused. So, we can touch on Romans chapter 11 because Romans chapter 11 is one of Dr. Brown's, quote, sugar sticks. And in my very first debate with him, he literally did not know how to respond to what I was saying. It's interesting, Mike, that I don't know, I've never counted, but I've heard from a serious number of people who had followed Dr. Brown for years, literally for years. And they contacted me and said, we've never seen Dr. Brown so rattled in all of our lives. He was literally lost. And several of those individuals, by the way, are also now full preterists. But nonetheless, I just wanted to point that out, that Dr. Brown believes that Romans chapter 11 is his sugar stick.
Well, let me
He bases everything on it. He bases Zechariah 12 on it.
Yes. Now, in your first debate, a lot of your emphasis was on the Old Testament passages that Paul is echoing and he's bringing up in Romans 9 through 11. And this is supposed to be Brown's specialty. He's supposed to be an Old Testament scholar. And I think that is really what kind of shook him. I don't think he was new to preterism, for one thing. So we'll give him a little bit of a benefit of a doubt, trying to understand our position. But I think the majority of him being shaken was the fact that he couldn't handle, hey, these guys are supposed to be a joke. I mean, all we have to do is look outside and the second coming happen. So he didn't prepare. It was clear the man did not prepare for the first debate. So his lack of preparation, lack of understanding of our position, and your domination of the Old Testament text, I think, just really, really shook him.
I think that's a very fair assessment. I really honestly do, because when I was pointing out, and we'll get into it more perhaps this evening, but when I was pointing out that the two key passages that Paul was appealing to in Romans chapter 11, 26 and 27, and those two passages are Isaiah 27 and Isaiah 59, both of whom predicted the salvation of Israel at the time that Israel would be judged for shedding innocent blood. And Dr. Brown responded by saying, those are passages on judgment. They're not passages on salvation. And I kept pointing out, and finally, he actually conceded in the debate that I was right, that Isaiah rather, and thus Paul, was conflating judgment and salvation to occur at the same time. It would be the destruction of national Israel, the salvation of the remnant. And that's Paul's whole point in Romans.
But in the second debate, he would not concede that at all. And when you guys went to Isaiah 59 and Isaiah 62, he did his spiel where 80-70 was just a judgment. How in the world could we see that all the nations were judged? How in the world could we see that Israel became a light to the nations and she was saved at that time? And we've talked about this, Don, over and over and over again, especially with the premills or the dispensationalists. No matter what their stripe is, they do not understand the concept of the two Jerusalems or the two Israels. Can you go over that? Because I think, isn't that really what Michael Brown is really, really missing?
He had no concept when I mentioned it ever so briefly, especially in Zechariah 14. He was completely lost, had no clue. It was almost like he had never even heard the concept before. I know he has, but throughout the Old Testament, this is found over and over and over. And preterists certainly are not the very first to point this out, that in many, many scholars, they have noted that you find text after text after text in which, on the one hand, Jerusalem is destroyed. On the other hand, Jerusalem is glorified. Well, the dispensationalists say, well, yeah, what that says is Old Covenant Jerusalem would be destroyed, but she would be restored. The same city. No, that's not the point. Isaiah chapter 24, in predicting the destruction of Jerusalem and the heaven and earth of Jerusalem and the temple and et cetera, says she will fall and never rise again. So that tells us that the Old Covenant Jerusalem was to be destroyed, never to rise. That doesn't mean it wouldn't exist as a physical city, but it would never rise again as God's covenant people. Just like Isaiah chapter 65. The Lord promised, behold, I create a new heaven and a new earth, and the former what? Former heaven and earth. That's an elliptical statement. The former shall no longer be remembered. So here's God promising the destruction of a heaven and earth and a Jerusalem. That term shall no longer be remembered. The Greek word the Hebrew word remember there is from Zechariah. And it's a covenantal remembrance. It doesn't mean that, I'll even go so far as to say this, although this is certainly debatable from our perspective, but the people that constituted, quote, Israel at that time, the city, the temple, the creation that constituted Old Covenant Israel at the time, would no longer be remembered covenantally. They might be remembered physically or exist physically, but they would no longer have a covenant relationship with God. They would never rise again in that form.
Right.
That's the whole point. And yet, Dr. Brown just simply refuses, basically, to consider that aspect of it. And what he likes to do is to go to a passage such as Zechariah chapter 12, for instance. He, in the debate with Steve, he kept going to Zechariah chapter 12. This simply has not taken place. This is a time in which Jerusalem will be attacked by the foreign nations, but God will intervene and will deliver them. That has never happened from the time of Zechariah until the current time. So number one, he's taking it absolutely literally, of literal physical Judah and Jerusalem. Number two, he is refusing to see, there's several key motifs in Zechariah chapter 12, verses 1 through 9, that cue us into the fact that he's probably talking about the heavenly Jerusalem, not the earthly Jerusalem. But again, Dr. Brown is so fixated on the physical that he refuses to see the spiritual. You got a great chart up there. Why don't you go through your chart just a little bit and explain what we're trying to say here?
Yeah. If I can pull it up, I'm learning all this technical stuff with StreamYard. Let's see.
I've been playing with Zoom and my PowerPoints, trying to do the same thing.
Okay, this isn't exactly what I wanted. Let's go to Zechariah here and look at some parallels between this and the Olivet discourse. Notice in the debate that Steve avoided anything that had anything to do with the coming of the Lord.
Yes.
Whether it was Acts 3, whether it was Zechariah 12, which brings in Matthew 24:30, which brings in Revelation 1:7. he didn't want to go there at all because he knows Brown would have destroyed his partial preterism, showed it to be completely arbitrary, just as Dr. Brown did with Mr. Doug Wilson on the End of the Age. And I thought he did a great job on that as well. But look at the parallels. I know you've done charts. I've done charts on this. Number one, we have a gathering and the siege of Jerusalem by the surrounding nations takes place. Well, what do we have in the Olivet discourse when you see the army surrounding Jerusalem? Now, the Roman armies, Don, those armies consisted of the nations of the then known world because
Absolutely.
they assimilated their best fighting men from those nations. Not only that, but as James Stuart Russell points out, that the towns and cities within Israel were known as individual nations with individual kings. And so when you have the Idumeans or the Zealots coming, all right, and they surround the city there for a time. So you have all kinds of nations and kings that are waging war at this time between AD 67 and 70. So we have the surrounding of the nations. We have the judgment of the nations that take place as well. And again, Brown talks about, well, all the nations didn't surround. This is not, and being an Old Testament scholar, you would think he would know. I mean, David talks about all the nations were surrounding him and attacking him, and there's a lot of passages, and I think Ezekiel, Zephaniah, some other passages where all nations is referred to, but it's not. It's all nations of the then known world.
Absolutely.
Or maybe just a few, we're not talking about the entire globe. So he's not taking these passages in their historical context. They look upon Jesus, whom they have pierced, and mourn. I wanted to pick your brain on this a little bit. Most commentators understand that when Jesus here in Matthew 24:30 is quoting Zechariah 12 and John in Revelation 1:7, that the mourning is a mourning of judgment, of sadness. But some would say, yeah, but they're changing the meaning of the mourning in the original context of Zechariah 12, which is supposed to be repentance. I think that you have argued in the past that, no, I don't even think Zechariah 12 is necessarily referring to a mourning of repentance.
I'm not convinced that it is. I wouldn't take a hard, fast stand against that, because on the day of Pentecost, you have nations, Jews, devout men out of every nation under heaven. There's a great example of the language that you were referring to. It's not talking about people from South America, or from Jamaica or wherever gathered to Jerusalem. And to reinforce that point, Nebuchadnezzar, when he was speaking, prayed to the God of heaven and said, he has given me the kingdom over every nation under heaven, everywhere the birds fly. Well, you know what? Birds fly in Russia, China, India, South America, North America, etc. But I'm real sure Nebuchadnezzar wasn't given authority over all of those kingdoms. So very, very often in the Bible, we have universalistic language being used, but it's speaking of the then known world. Dr. Brown refuses to consider these contextual situations. And Obadiah, I will gather all nations against you. Well, that's God predicting the fall of the Idumeans, the Edomites, Bozrah, Petra, etc. Well, it happened in 583 BC at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar, but Ezekiel 25 and Jeremiah chapter 25 give a list of the 25 nations that Nebuchadnezzar, king of the Chaldeans, destroyed at the time that he destroyed Edom. Yet he destroys all the nations of the earth. So when Dr. Brown wants to camp out and said, oh, look, all the nations of the earth are going to gather against Jerusalem, what happens to the reality of ancient cosmology? Do we just honor it in some text, or do we honor it consistently where the text demanded? And so, to go back to your question, there was mourning on the part of all nations of the earth, certainly of the tribes of Judah on the day of Pentecost. When they heard this, they were pricked in their heart. And they said to Peter and to the rest of the apostles, men and brethren, what shall we do? Now, is that the mourning over the one whom they had pierced? A person could certainly make that argument. The trouble of that is, in my estimation, in Matthew chapter 24, verse 30, Jesus is quoting it in a judgment context. He's not quoting it in a context of repentance.
Exactly.
Same thing with Revelation chapter 1. Every eye shall see him, and all the nations of the earth shall mourn. All of those, they shall look upon him, even those who pierced him. Well, that's judgment on Israel, pretty clearly.
Yeah, the tribes of the land.
Tribes of the land. And so if someone were to say, well, could it include both? Well, if you want to make that stretch, I'm not going to throw rocks at you, but I certainly think the predominant view, or the predominantly correct view, is judgment of AD 70.
Yeah, I would agree. And going back to number 2, again, at the time of the judgment of national Israel, we also have Jerusalem is saved, which in Matthew 24, you have the Olivet discourse, you have the judgment of old covenant Jerusalem, but yet the remnant is to look up for their redemption. The restoration is nigh. So there you have the spiritual Jerusalem from above. Galatians chapter 4 is saved during the time when old covenant Jerusalem is judged. Let's see here. Let's go on. Oh, we have false prophets and demons are cleansed from the land. And of course, this was the time for the judgment of the demons and Satan as well in the Olivet discourse.
I believe on number 4, that's supposed to be chapter 13, verses 2 and 3.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll have to change that later.
Yeah.
All right. So again, we have the same motif. So Jesus is kind of tracking on both there.
Let's take a look a little bit closer, because Dr. Brown wanted to emphasize chapter 14. And I know you're going to get to it here in your chart there, number 7 especially. Well, number 6, number 5. Okay. So let's just look at a few constituent elements. You know, unless Dr. Brown is wanting to create 2 different sieges of Jerusalem, all right, from chapter 12 versus chapter 14, then guess what? And by the way, he said nothing like this has ever happened before. Well, Dr. Brown sometimes likes to appeal to the ancient church writers. Well, let's appeal to some of the early church writers on this. Not that you and I think that they're the end of all and be all, and we certainly don't think they're inspired. But Eusebius, commenting on both Zechariah 12 and Zechariah 14, as well as Isaiah chapter 66, the Lord's coming in fire, said that happened in AD 70. And if anybody wants that source, I'll be more than happy to give you the specific source. So here is Eusebius, 4th century, and he's called the father of church history from the 4th century. He says Zechariah 12, Zechariah 14, Isaiah 66, fulfilled in AD 70 with the Lord's coming in flaming fire.
Is he taking 2 Thessalonians?
No, he did not.
Okay. It's just a nebulous coming in flaming fire.
Eusebius, I don't know how to say this. Eusebius
Just inconsistent.
Was a really fascinating character. And as many scholars have said and noted, when we read Eusebius, we have to understand that he was an apologist for Constantine. And so much of his theology, even his eschatology, was formulated to make Constantine look really, really good.
Yeah, right.
Now, I'm not enough of a scholar on Eusebius to be able to go in and ferret that out and say, oh yeah, this is what he was doing here. Okay, I'm just reading the scholars who have studied Eusebius very, very carefully, and that's what they have a tendency to say. The point being here, all throughout church history, all right, all throughout church history, there have been extremely noted scholars who have acknowledged that Zechariah 14 applied to AD 70. Adam Clarke most assuredly did. Barnes did.
Wow.
Others said this was fulfilled in AD 70 with the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans. And those are just a couple off the top of my head there. So look at Zechariah what Zechariah chapter 14 says. Behold, the day of the Lord is coming. Your spoil will be divided in your midst. I will gather all nations for battle against Jerusalem. The city shall be taken, the houses rifled, the women ravished, and the city shall go into captivity. Well, wait a minute. That's not Zechariah chapter 12 based upon Dr. Brown's literalistic reading of chapter 12. Zechariah chapter 12, he says the city is completely delivered. No capturing of Jerusalem in Zechariah chapter 12. So is Dr. Brown going to say, well, actually, we've got two separate captivities, or excuse me, two separate besiegements in view? Yeah. Well, no, because in both, guess what we have? We have the deliverance of the remnant, and we have David the king ruling, and we have, to use the terminology of Zechariah chapter 12, verse 10 and following, the opening of on the house of David and on the inhabitant of Jerusalem, the spirit of grace and supplication. In other words, the time of cleansing for sin. And Zechariah chapter 14, you have the river of life flowing out from the city and from the temple. So Dr. Brown would have a really, really severe, difficult time creating a dichotomy. And by the way, I'm not a betting man, but if I were a betting man, I would say, and because we know from the debate itself, he correlates chapter 12 with chapter 14. He clearly has not seen the problems that creates for him. Whereas in chapter 12, there is no siege with any success whatsoever. But in chapter 14, the spoil will be divided in your midst. The city shall be taken, the houses rivaled, the women ravished. Well, where is that in chapter 12? Not there. That's a real problem for Dr. Brown, who says, oh, these are both talking about the same thing. Mm-hmm. They are talking about the same thing, but that just simply shows that Dr. Brown is misconstruing chapter 12. It just doesn't work.
Amen. Okay, so we have a way of escape in both. Number 6, I like, this day is only known by the Lord. And of course, Reformed scholars such as John Gill, Adam Clarke. I don't think Adam Clarke is Reformed, but John Gill is. They take the day and hour of Matthew 24:36 that's supposed to be unknown to anybody, even the Son of Man, as referring to AD 70.
Yes.
And, this is, I don't really think that this is necessarily a statement that Jesus doesn't know everything.
I agree.
I think it's more of a statement dealing with two issues. I'll let you do the feast aspect of it. I'll do maybe the wedding terminology. And that is, they would blow a horn. The groom and the bride, especially the bride, didn't know when the wedding would take place. Only the father knew. Right. And the father would talk to the groomsmen, sometimes one or two of them. And then they would go and they would take the groom and they would blow the trumpet. But the bride did not know the day or the hour or the time. It was only up to the father. Not even the son knew. So that is, when he's saying this, he's communicating to a Jewish worldview. Oh, the time of the wedding, right? And then, but it also echoes something else, Don.
And this is so exciting. I've made the comment before that the Olivet discourse is full of festal imagery and language if we are attuned to it. And unfortunately, the great majority of modern day Bible readers are not attuned to it, because we are not attuned to the concept, the practices, the vernacular of Israel's feast days. Let me explain it as briefly as I can. the great feast day of Rosh Hashanah, which foreshadowed the judgment, was to be initiated on the new moon. Pardon me. Well, what happens if you got clouds, if you got fog? You can't see the new moon appear. And so the Jewish rabbis referred to Rosh Hashanah and none other of the other feast days so far as I've been able to determine. But they referred to Rosh Hashanah as the feast day concerning which no man knows the day or the hour. The reason for that being, as I just indicated, they could not start the feast day until that little bitty sliver of the new moon appeared in the sky. Well, guess what? Jerusalem, Judea, was prone to heavy fog at times. You couldn't see the tip of your hand holding it up high, much less see the new moon. You got clouds. Now, just recently, I read an article on the internet, and he said, well, I've read that argument that the rabbis called Rosh Hashanah the feast concerning which no man knows the day or the hour. He said, well, that's ridiculous. He said, if they knew the day of the month on which it started the previous month, then they would know the day and the hour. Well, I would say that's nonsense, because the Jewish calendar had to add and subtract days because it was based strictly and solely upon a 30-day month. Well, guess what? That doesn't calculate. And so while it may sound initially like a good argument to say, well, if they knew that Rosh Hashanah was on this particular day last month, then all they have to do is count 30 days forward, and they know the exact day and hour. That has a sense of plausibility, but it doesn't take the full account of the lunar calendar, which fluctuated, into account. And it doesn't account for the fact that the rabbis said Rosh Hashanah was the feast day concerning which no man knows the day or the hour. So what's Jesus saying here in Matthew chapter 24? Just like Matthew 23:39 that we talked about last week, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, was a song sung as the pilgrims came to observe the feast days. Jesus was cryptically saying Jerusalem would be besieged and destroyed during the feast days. That happened historically. Now, you can call that either the greatest coincidence in all the history of the world, or you can say Jesus was giving a hint to his apostles and thus to his disciples to say, guys, you need to be watching the feast days. You need to be looking, because that's going to be the time when Jerusalem is going to be surrounded by the armies. When you see that begin to take place, you need to get out of Dodge. So that's what he's doing when he says, but of that day and hour knows no man. He's telling them the day of judgment, Rosh Hashanah, is coming. Well, when was it coming? This generation shall by no means pass until all of these things are fulfilled. Jesus wasn't changing the subject at all when he said, but of that day and hour knows no man. No. He was driving home the point that it was the judgment that was coming in that generation. And just like Rosh Hashanah, they did not know the day or the hour that judgment was coming, but they did know it was going to be in that generation. And, I was reading one scholarly paper just a couple of weeks ago, Mike, and this guy was saying a reconsideration of the meaning of this generation in the Olivet discourse. And I thought, okay, let's wonder what he means by a reconsideration.
Okay.
And he wound up saying the view and the argument that Jesus could know the generation but not the day and the hour of his coming is a naive and rather ignorant argument. And I'm going, really? So if I call my buddy Mike Sullivan up and I say, hey, Mike, come next spring, I'm going to come visit you. And you say, well, when will it be, Don? I say, I don't know the day or the hour yet. I don't know I don't know exactly when I'll be there. That's a naive statement for me to make, Mike. It's an ignorant statement for me to make.
That's crazy.
And so you can imagine what this scholar meant by reimagining.
Yeah. I mean, even if we take the wedding motif out of the cultural context of this, or the feast element out of the historical context of this, and we just look at it the way Don has, you know, he understood it was going to be in their generation, but not the day and hour. There's no contradiction at all. And of course, Gentry and some of these other partial preterists try and make this big distinction between this generation and day and hour. And it goes nowhere. And that is why, Don, that is why Steve did not want to go to the Olivet discourse or to Zechariah 12 and to 14, because Steve has a world of problem in the Olivet discourse trying to figure out which passage is the coming of the Lord in AD 70 and which one's at the end of world history. And he knows he would have gotten eaten alive, I think.
I think you're exactly right. Steve is a plenty sharp guy. He can see the train coming on some of these texts. And so, as he did in his book, which I'm just finishing up my review in response to, he very often has to resort to arguments like, well, this passage over here uses these terms, words, and phrases. This passage over here appears to be using the same words, terms, and phrases. Oh, but wait, it leaves out a couple of words that this other text uses. Therefore, they must be different. And in my book, The Resurrection Feast Fulfilled, an examination or a study of Israel's last feast day, Sukkot, and the resurrection, I take Steve to task pretty hard on that. I'm not unkind, but I take him to task pretty hard because he says, I would never argue like that. But in the book, he argued like that over and over and over again. So he knows that's an illegitimate hermeneutic, but he also knows that in his debate with Dr. Michael Brown, that Michael Brown is going to go right straight for the jugular vein and point out that in these texts that Steve is referring to as fulfilled, they're talking about the coming of the Lord.
Yeah, the second coming. And
second coming.
That would open up a can of worms that he just didn't want to deal with.
That's exactly right.
Okay, so number 7, there's always light.
Oh,
in the New Jerusalem. I mean, we're looking at Isaiah 60 through 66.
Yeah.
The passages, the New Jerusalem and Revelation. I make the parallel. Sometimes you refer to it as lightning, most do, but I tend to think I go with the Aramaic English translation, which sees this as Christ coming as sunshine shining from the east to the west. Just like I would Malachi 4:2, the Son of Righteousness coming, and he is the day star that would arise, that was dawning and that was arising in the heart of the believer. And in Revelation, they're promised, if they persevere, that they would have the day star. Jesus is the day star. So everything early on in Revelation that they're promised they're going to get soon at Christ's soon coming, most of them are all related to the new creation.
Oh, yeah.
And so at the end of Revelation, again, you have the imminent time text connecting to the fact that they're receiving the new creation. So the day star Christ is revealed in them, just like Jesus said, the kingdom of God will be revealed in you. Now, getting to the kingdom and Christ coming, then we get to number 8. We have living waters flow from the New Jerusalem when the king and the kingdom arrive. Now, do you want to address number 7 and then go right into 8?
Well, I was just simply, I was sitting here thinking as you were talking that, and you referenced Isaiah chapter 60 and following, the beautiful, beautiful passages in Isaiah chapter 60, there will be no more need of the sun or of the moon, for God is their light, echoed directly in Revelation chapter 21 in the New Jerusalem. There is no need of the sun nor of the moon because God is the light. And we absolutely have to consider what Jesus said in John chapter 8. And remember what John chapter 8, what is the festal setting for John chapter 8? It's the last day of the Feast of Sukkot. And on that last great day, of course, during the feast, what did they do? They had this monstrous, monstrous candelabra set up in the courtyard of Israel, in the temple.
It
Now,
lit up the whole city, literally.
yeah, it lit up the whole city. I mean, I can't even imagine a candelabra that big, Mike.
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but it's just staggering to even think about it. Folks, they had to climb ladders in order to light the candles or the oil pots on the ends of the arms of this candelabra, the menorah, if you want to use a more proper term. So it would light up the whole city at night. Think about that. Jerusalem was not a little bitty podunk town. And so on this last day, the great day of the feast, Jesus says, what? I am the light of the world. Okay? Now, they all marveled and rejoiced in the beauty and the glory of the Jerusalem menorah that gave light to the whole city and lit up the entire massive crowd. And Jesus stands up on that last great day. And of course, he also said, I'm the water of life. You know? So
which goes with their tradition of going down to the river, getting the water, and
exactly
go from the temple.
Jesus is drawing on so much of the imagery of Sukkot there in John chapter 7, John chapter 8. The whole city is abuzz with talk about him, for crying out loud. Because when he stands up and yells out, the language of the Greek is very, very powerful in John chapter 7. Jesus yelled, I am the light of the world, or I am the water of life. If any man comes unto me, out of his belly shall flow rivers of living water. I mean, he didn't just elbow a guy next to him and say, hey, guess what? I'm the water of life here, dude. He stands up and yells this out as probably as the water ceremony is taking place. And this water ceremony is a ceremony to recount how God, during the wilderness wandering, had provided Israel with water. And the ancient rabbis used to say it foreshadowed how in the last days, God would once again give them water, living waters. And here's Jesus. I am living water.
Yeah.
The scene there, I mean, it really makes you wonder. I mean, honestly, to put yourself into the audience, into the crowd, into that multitude, with Jesus' apostles undoubtedly gathered round him. And let's not forget that in John chapter 7, his own brothers urged him to go up to Jerusalem. You need to go up there and reveal yourself. If you're truly the Christ, why don't you go up there and just let everybody know? They thought he was crazy. They were doubting him. Okay, but Jesus' apostles are with him nonetheless when he goes up basically unannounced. And then he stands up and yells out, what are his apostles thinking? And then as he continues, I mean, he goes right from, he segues from I am living water, he segues directly into I am the light of the world. This is incredible. And I've tried 100 million times to put myself into that audience. What would have been my response as a human being to be standing there, and this Nazarene, for crying out loud, stands up and yells, he's the living water. And you've probably heard that very day, or during the 7-day feast days, you've probably heard the rabbis talk about the time of living waters. And we know that to a certain extent because on the very first day of Sukkot, during the time of Jesus, on the very first day, they read the Haftorah. Well, the Haftorah was a reading of two major Old Testament passages, Ezekiel 38 and 39, the story of Gog and Magog, and guess what? Zechariah 14. And in my book on Resurrection Feast Fulfilled, I point out the Jews joyfully listened to and read Zechariah 14. Well, why wouldn't they? Because in that day, the coming of the Lord, the coming of salvation, the coming of Israel's redemption, to bring all nations to serve the God of Israel, I mean, living waters are going to flow out. Yeah, And here's Jesus standing up saying, hey guys, I'm it.
I'm surprised they didn't read Ezekiel 47 with Zechariah 14.
And I've wondered about that. When I was researching my book, I got to wondering about that. Why was it Ezekiel 47 and the great prediction of the living waters that would flow out of Jerusalem? Why didn't they read that for their Torah? But I could not find any source that said they did.
Yeah, and see, Brown is just like, well, I mean, look around. How in the world are the nations being healed today and coming to this living water? And I'm like, why don't you just follow Jesus and Paul's hermeneutic instead of your hyper Pharisee hermeneutic? I mean, Jesus in John 7:37 through 39 says, according to the scriptures, the Old Testament scriptures, out of your heart or belly will flow living water. So he's saying that my followers in union with me are that millennial, quote unquote, temple of Ezekiel 47 and in what Ezekiel 36, I think, as well. That tabernacle. I mean, it's right there.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm obviously with you on that. I do not understand the overt overemphasis of the physical realities. I mean, at times I've considered it, as well as other views of eschatology, as just almost crass materialism.
Yeah, I know.
There is such an attachment to the physical realities of city, land, priesthood, sacrifices, and then you start getting down to the nitty-gritty with them. And with one individual I was corresponding on YouTube just recently, they were talking about, well, you know, Jesus has got to come and restore all things. I said, well, okay, is he going to restore Israel to the land? Well, no. Is he going to restore Jerusalem and the temple and the priesthood, animal sacrifices, physical circumcision, etc.? Well, no, I didn't mean that. I said, well, that's what the Jews believed in. That's what the Pharisees, let me say, believed in. Sadducees didn't when it came to resurrection. But nonetheless, that was a really powerful aspect of Israel, specifically the Pharisees, probably some other groups as well, the Essenes for sure that we know about. That was their expectation of the, quote, restoration of all things.
Yeah.
And so many modern day futurists want to buy into that, with the exception, I'll never forget this on Facebook. I'll tell this very quick anecdote. On Facebook, it's been a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago, William Vincent, I think you interacted with him just a little bit perhaps, but yeah, you did. But William Vincent tried to use the argument, well, Paul said he was a Pharisee. Pharisees believed in physical resurrection, therefore Paul believed in physical resurrection. Now, I used to believe that. As a young man, that was an argument that I used. Unfortunately, that argument just falls all apart into atoms and into dust when you look at Paul on trial. It's why I wrote a book entitled Paul on Trial, Paul, the Pharisees, and the Resurrection. But here's the point that I made with William Vincent. And by the way, this is documented by scholar after scholar after scholar. N.T. Wright points it out in his writings. The Pharisees probably did believe in physical resurrection, but their concept of the physical resurrection tied that physical resurrection to restoration of Israel to the land, restoration of the temple to its purity, restoration of the priesthood to the Zadokite, Levitical, Aaronic, pure priesthood, because it was so corrupt, restoration of a purified, bloody sacrificial system, restoration of the imposition of physical circumcision to be in the city of Jerusalem, on and on and on and on. So I said, now, William, this is what the Pharisees believed about resurrection. They never, ever separated it from all of these constituent elements. So you say you believe what Paul believed, and Paul believed what the Pharisees believed. So let me ask you, did Paul believe what the Pharisees believed about resurrection and restoration to the land, the city, the temple, the priesthood, et cetera, et cetera? What refused to answer it? Completely, totally abandoned the discussion.
Yeah, you can't pick and choose from these, and I'll go through a list of them here in a second. But it reminds me of one of the editors in the Schofield Reference Bible. In a note, it's talking about the sacrifices of the millennial temple.
Oh, yeah.
He admits, he says, this could be referring to the spiritual sacrifices of praise in the church. Huge problem, because if you take away one, you have to take away all of them. So if the sacrifices in the temple are spiritual, well, what about the temple that the sacrifices are in? Oh, okay, that might be spiritual. If the sacrifices are spiritual, maybe the temple is. Well, what about the city in which the temple is, and the land that it rests upon, and the heaven and earth, or the world that it consists of? And so, that is a real problem for the premillennialists and the dispensationalists.
Well, it's a real problem for any of the futurists who believe in a yet future, some sort, somehow, some way, conversion of, quote, national Israel. When you start talking, again, as Chris Date does, that he believes that national Israel will be restored and be saved. Well, what do you mean physical or national Israel? Physical Israel, and by that's what he means, physical Israel, of the bloodline of Abraham. I want to see as proof for the existence of that nation. But nonetheless, how do you argue for the restoration of national Israel without arguing for the restoration of temple, priesthood, sacrifices, as you were just saying? How do you delineate?
The whole kit and caboodle.
Yeah, who gives you the right to cherry pick here and say, oh, yeah, it's Israel, but it's Israel without land, city, temple? I mean, that was Israel.
While I'm thinking about it, we were talking about the Hebrew word for forever, and how Brown is just so inconsistent, because we have about 2,000 years where Israel wasn't in the land forever. So here's another issue, is that there were promises that circumcision would last forever. But now you've got dispensationalists and historic premillennials. Well, we know Paul says that this is spiritually fulfilled. Well, again, they all go together. You can't cherry pick. So if the circumcision promises forever can be spiritualized and not be forever, then why can't the land promises that are supposed to be forever be interpreted the same way? Again, this inconsistent hermeneutic.
I have used this argument in absolutely countless discussions with dispensationalists, futurists of all sorts down through the years, when they say, "Oh, Israel's promised the land forever." You're just trying to destroy God's word. Well, no, it's honoring what the texts say. Everything that we've mentioned here: circumcision, priesthood, temple, land, on and on and on. There you go.
Born physically into the old covenant. Jesus says you have to be born from above. This is the new covenant, Nicodemus. I'm doing something new. This is Isaiah's new thing, that he was talking about.
That's right.
Circumcision, spiritual circumcision. Physical temple, old covenant tabernacle, spiritual in the new. Priesthood, sacrifices, all of these.
Every one of them.
Land, even heaven and earth. I mean, Hebrews talks about that which was made, going back to Hebrews 1, it was being shaken. That world was being shaken one last time, because the spiritual things of the new covenant, new heavens and new earth, would remain after that was shaken and taken out of the way.
And yet it's not difficult at all to get some futurists at least. And by the way, Dr. Brown, when I asked him, has circumcision, do you impose physical circumcision? I don't remember that. I think that was in our first debate. He said, oh, of course I do. And he was joking, of course. No, he doesn't. Right. And yet it was supposed to be an everlasting covenant between God and Israel. Genesis chapter 17.
And he fudged on the Sabbath too. Well,
oh yes, he did. He fudged on the Sabbath.
I don't adhere to it legalistically. It's like,
Right.
where are you getting that from the text? You either adhere to it or you don't, dude.
Yeah.
It's
Just today on YouTube, I had a guy, and in one of my comments on one of my videos, I don't even remember which video it was he was commenting on, but I had mentioned the passing of the law. And this guy says, well, I'm a full preterist, but the law did not pass away. I keep it all. Now, he said, I don't keep the physical sacrificial ordinances, but I keep the law. Well, what he means by that is the Sabbath. So once again, he's picking, he's choosing, he's cherry picking and saying, yeah, this is gone, this stays, et cetera, et cetera. And it just becomes a mishmash. And of course, people say, well, if you're saying that the 10 Commandments were done away with, then we're free to do this, that, and other. No. That's ridiculous. That was a covenantal structure. The Sabbath, as a covenantal sign, was set within the Decalogue as, I would even say to a certain extent, as an anchor, as a covenantal anchor of the entire covenant. God said, I gave you the Sabbath as a sign of the deliverance from Egypt. Deuteronomy chapter 5 and verse 15. Well, you know what? I don't think God delivered you and me from literal physical Egyptian captivity. And yet the Sabbath was given as a memorial and as a sign of that deliverance.
Yeah.
How could we ever observe Sabbath as a deliverance from Egyptian captivity?
Exactly. And Hebrews 3 and 4 and Hebrews 9 and 10 is really clear that another day that Hebrews 3 and 4 is talking about, as far as the Sabbath rest that was promised in the Psalms and that David talked about, he picks up again in chapters 9 and 10. And he says that day was approaching. It was at hand. The judgment upon the enemies was about to take place. When would the Sabbath rest come? When would this judgment take place? He who's coming will come in a very, very little while and will not delay. So, yeah, but let's I want to get into Genesis 15 verse 7, because that was a big thing, whether this covenant was unconditional or conditional. But before I do that, I just want to summarize. So Steve just missed the boat when we're talking about Zechariah 12 through 14. He could have went to Matthew, because Jesus clearly in the Olivet discourse, when he says in Luke 21 verse 22 that all that was written in the Old Testament would be fulfilled in his generation, including him coming upon the clouds, upon those who would mourn, Zechariah 12, in judgment, that this is the second coming. It would take place in their generation. And this is the fulfillment of Zechariah 12 and 14. Not only that, but he missed the boat on the feasts, because in the Olivet discourse, and Brown brings it out. He brought it out in your debate. Oh, well, this is the last, 4-3 fall feasts. And you're like, well, I'm glad you brought this topic up, Michael Brown. Because, you go to Colossians 2, you go to Hebrews 10:1. These were types and shadows of the new covenant good things that were about to come in AD 70 at Christ's coming. And if those feasts have not been fulfilled, then we're still under every jot and every tittle of the law. And again, that was another subject that Michael Brown just did not answer in your debate with him. But
I think it's very, very important to drive home the point that you're making there in regard to Luke chapter 21 and verse 22, as it takes us directly back to Zechariah 12 to 14. So many of the constituent elements of Zechariah 12 through 14, okay, for instance, Zechariah chapter 13, 6 and following, it shall come to pass that 2/3 of the people shall perish. Only 1/3 shall be saved. That's the righteous remnant. That's the Olivet discourse, found profoundly throughout the Olivet discourse. And pardon me. Of course, in Zechariah chapter 13, you also have the time of the betrayal of the Messiah. They weighed out for me 30 pieces. I think that's in chapter 13, isn't it? Strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. That's a lead up to the Olivet discourse. That's the betrayal of Jesus that took place in Matthew chapter 25. So what we have here is Zechariah, and I believe it's I believe it was Carrington, who said, no other book had such a profound impact or influence on the book of Revelation than did the book of Zechariah. And my goodness gracious, at the scholars, and Gregg Beale in his massive book, Commentary on the New Testament Use of the Old Testament, Gregg Beale points out, well, Zechariah here 12, Zechariah 13 here, Zechariah 14 here in the book of Revelation.
Until, Don, you start studying Daniel, and when you're deep in Daniel, then you're looking at Revelation. You're just seeing, all you're seeing is Daniel. And then you're in Ezekiel, and you're like, wow, look at all these.
I know.
It's just rich in all of those, but you're right.
Well,
Zechariah is just all
that's
over.
why it's estimated that there's something over 400 allusions or echoes or citations or what have you. The scholars use all different sorts of words to define it or to describe it. But the point of it is, Revelation is absolutely saturated with the Old Testament. So the point being that here in Zechariah chapter 12 to 14, we have all of these constituent elements that Jesus in the Olivet discourse refers directly to. And in Luke chapter 21, verse 22, after giving all of these citations and echoes of Zechariah 12 to 14, these be the days of vengeance in which all things that are written must be fulfilled. So since and if Jesus in Luke chapter 21, 22 says all of the things that I've been talking about, all of the things that are written will be fulfilled in AD 70, then how are you going to say, Dr. Brown, this would be a question for him, how are you going to say, well, Zechariah 12 sure wasn't fulfilled? Well, Jesus is alluding, as your chart so pointed out so well, Zechariah chapter 12, the siege of the city, Luke chapter 21, the siege of the city. Where are you going to delineate? Then that brings us back, how are you going to delineate between Zechariah 12 and Zechariah 14, Dr. Brown? You got a real serious problem here. So this is a powerful illustration of how Scripture interprets Scripture for us if we are willing to be attuned to it, and to the term that I really like to use, if we're willing to connect the dots.
Yeah.
Scriptura analogia is the fancy word for it, but
yeah. And Steve pulled he says, well, I've preached on Zechariah 12 through 14, and, I see how this is, spiritually, the salvation. But this is at the second coming is when the salvation takes place. In Revelation 21 and 22, that the new creation, that's when the rivers start flowing at the second coming. So he didn't want to deal with that. It reminds me of James White when he was in a debate with a Muslim, Shabir Ali. Shabir said, I can't accept Jesus or your Jesus as a New Testament prophet because he promised his second coming to take place in their generation. And this was before he was a partial preterist. He says, oh, well, I preached on that. I refer you to.
Yeah. I don't want to talk about that now. Look, go over here.
Crazy old me. I actually went and listened to his, and he didn't deal with it. He took that as a second, a future coming, but he didn't deal with this generation. So it's kind of a debater tactic. Well, I don't have time for this, and I have to look at my other stuff. But he missed a golden opportunity there on Zechariah 12 to 14. Let me ask you, the other thing that came up in this debate was the promise made to Abraham. Only he puts Abraham to sleep. God alone passes through the animal pieces. I think Brown's point is, well, this is an unconditional covenant that God is going to keep even unbelieving Israel break his other parts of the covenant, apparently, in the land forever. It's unconditional. It doesn't have anything to do, apparently, with what they believe or what they do.
Well, the problem with asserting, just unilaterally asserting, as he did, that a unilateral covenant cannot be violated is illogical. If the one making the covenant has within himself the conditions, he may not assert them explicitly, but if the sin and the violations of what he is saying and what he is promising, if the recipients become so egregiously abusive, that doesn't mean he's obligated to go ahead and to give that. And when you read further, and this is where this is what Dr. Brown refuses to pay attention to. Deuteronomy 11 and how many other passages, my goodness gracious, it would take 30 minutes to list all of them. Over and over and over again, we are told, you keep the law, you get to live on the land. You violate the law, and the land will vomit you out. I mean, this is what Deuteronomy chapter 28 to 30 is all about. And remember, Deuteronomy 28 to 30 is about Israel and the land, God's promise of the land to Israel. So if you want to say, well, the Abrahamic land promise was unconditional, then you're going to have to say that it was unconditional for Israel because they are the descendants of Abraham. But that doesn't work because Deuteronomy 28 to 30, I've never even counted the number of times, but it's multiple times in which God said, you break my covenant, here's what's going to happen to you. You're going to be taken off the land will vomit you out, you will be captive in all nations of the world. So here is God saying, yeah, I made a promise to Abraham. And by the way, he didn't have to give it to Abraham and his seed, although the promise literally was, according to Deuteronomy 33 or 34, verse 2 and 3, the promise was to Abraham and his seed. Makes it very clear. But when we see that the promise to the seed was absolutely conditional, then guess what? That's the final word.
Yeah.
Unless you want to say, well, guess what? Abraham, I'm going to give it to you and you alone, not your seed. No, that's not what he said. But to the seed, he gave the conditions of the promise.
Yeah. And ultimately, that seed is fulfilled in Christ.
Obviously.
Yes. Well, we are at our 1 hour mark.
Yes, we are.
Your Jan usually has some food ready for you.
Yes, she does.
So we'll talk about whether or not we want to pick this up, or do you want to talk about it? Do you think we need to do a part 3, or?
We'll talk about it later.
Okay.
And maybe we can get some feedback on some folks who watch this. If they watch it and they say, well, hey, why didn't you guys cover what Dr. Brown said here or what Steve said over here? Folks, send us your suggestions. And if we think that we want to give it a third show, then we certainly will. We want to cover what you think is relevant, what will be helpful to you, the folks who are watching. So with that, I'm going to say good night and God bless.
Absolutely. Good night, guys. Thanks for joining us.
In God whose word I praise, in the Lord whose word I praise, in God alone I trust, I will not be afraid. What can mortal man do to me?